Welcome back. In our last lecture, we discussed the process of editing our writing, and we talked about the two major approaches. A holistic approach that considers the essay as a whole and then works down to the level of the sentence or the phrase. And we talked about line-by-line editing, which is just what it sounds like, reading each line carefully in order to correct and strengthen the essay. As practice, we started the editing process by examining an example of a 5-paragraph essay on Charlotte Perkins Gilman's short story, The Yellow Wallpaper. After a quick read-through in which we analyzed the essay, we identified its main claim, and paid some attention to whether or not the supporting points helped to prove that main claim, we then crafted an outline of the essay in its present form. And this allowed us to see some weaknesses almost immediately. For example, we noted that the main claim that the essay made was pretty clearly stated, and this main claim was that the yellow wallpaper appears to be about the narrator's decline into insanity, but what our writer really wants to argue is that it's actually about gender inequality. Fair enough. But as we worked our way through the essay, we noted that the writer seemed to lose sight of his thesis statement as he worked through it, and he only really remembered it in the final paragraph. Although the 3 supporting paragraphs in the middle of the essay each had direct quotes that could be used in support of the main claim, the writer neglected to explicitly explain and analyze those quotes with an eye toward shoring up the main claim of the paper. Instead, the quotes were more or less left to stand on their own, and the reader had to infer how they worked in support of the thesis statement. There were also some awkward phrases, some typos, and some incorrect punctuation. In the first step of the editing process, we've identified what some of the issues are, and we've thought about some ways to improve the problem areas of the essay. Now, it's time to put our thoughts into action and start rewriting. And one more time, you're going to get so tired of hearing me say this, but step 1 is always make sure that you are working with a clearly articulated main claim or thesis or argumentative position. Very often, the problems that occur in the later sections of a paper or in portions of a letter arise from the fact that the writer has not really articulated a clear main position. If your main claim is clear and you keep it foremost in your mind, then very often the supporting points simply fall into place and the structure is logical from the outset. If you're not sure of what exactly it is you're trying to argue, then the paper or the letter or the article can wander. But be assured, in early drafting, such wandering can be a good thing and it can be hugely productive. For example, you might discover on page 5 of a paper that you thought was about the lack of authority of King Hrothgar in the medieval poem Beowulf, that what you're really interested in is how the character of Beowulf himself uses the example of Hrothgar as a guide to what not to do once he becomes king. So suddenly on page 5, your main focus shifts, and the rest of the paper ends up being about Beowulf, not Hrothgar. That's all fine, but what it does is make for a split personality paper, and that is one that lacks coherence. This is why editing is so important. Once you've realized this, you can go back, edit, and rewrite the paper so that you're still able to use much of that same evidence about King Hrothgar, but now you're recasting it as being in support of a main claim about the character of Beowulf. Ultimately, it's not too much of a change, but it's a change that has to happen if the paper's going to make sense. So while wandering can be useful in the drafting stage, it is not something that your audience will necessarily appreciate. A compelling piece of writing is going to engage your audience from the beginning. It's going to guide them through a claim that's clearly articulated from the outset. You don't want your audience to have to stop, to think, to return to your main claim, and then try to figure out on their own how some of these disjointed pieces all fit together. So let's go back to our example of an attempt at a 5-paragraph essay, and let's pay careful attention to the thesis. Here's the introductory paragraph as it stands now. It says essentially, the yellow wallpaper is a story about Charlotte Perkins Gilman about how a woman goes crazy. So here's how that paragraph reads. The yellow wallpaper is a story by Charlotte Perkins Gilman about how a woman goes crazy. We read the story as if we are reading her journal, and this is how we learn that she is going mad. The readers can see that she is losing her grip on reality because she describes things that can only be hallucinations. But Charlotte's story isn't really about going crazy. It's about how women in her day were considered inferior to men. And again, as I've said before, the thesis statement is actually pretty clear here. We could underline it if we wanted to, without any real problem. But while it's certainly an argument, the question should be, is it specific enough to guide the writer through the rest of the paper? Well, I would say that the intro paragraph could definitely benefit from a little more detail. And if you recall from our editing exercises in the last lecture, we decided that we would try and identify 3 points that work to support a main claim about gender inequality in this story. And those 3 points were the way the male characters in the story are depicted, the way the bedroom in which the narrator spends most of her time is described, and then the 3rd point would be something to do with the image of the wallpaper, behind the pattern of which the narrator thinks she can see a woman who's trying to escape. So what we should do now is try and put those details into the thesis statement. And while we're at it, we're going to go ahead and correct another error, which is the use of the author's first name, Charlotte, rather than her last, as would be much more appropriate in a formal essay like this one. So now, the thesis statement in the intro paragraph might read something like this. While on the surface the yellow wallpaper seems to be about one woman's descent into insanity, closer analysis reveals that the story is really a comment on the gender inequality of Gilman's day, as the depictions of male characters, the description of the narrator's bedroom, and the symbolism of the yellow wallpaper make plain. All right, this thesis statement is much more polished and more specific than it was before, and it clearly signposts where this paper is going. Paragraph 2 should deal with the depiction of men. Paragraph 3 with the description of the bedroom. And paragraph 4 should deal with the wallpaper itself. So let's see if the paper goes on to do that. Here's paragraph 2. The story starts with us reading the narrator's journal, and we learn that she's living in a house out in the country. From her journal, we learn she's having some sort of nervous breakdown. She writes, "If a physician of high standing and one's own husband assures friends and relatives that there is really nothing the matter with one but temporary nervous depression, a slight hysterical tendency, what is one to do? My brother is also a physician and also of high standing, and he says the same thing. So I take phosphates or phosphites, whichever it is, and tonics, and air, and exercise, and journeys, and am absolutely forbidden to work until I am well again." So from this passage, we learn the main character's basic situation. Okay, if we remember that this paragraph is supposed to be making the point that the depiction of men in the story is intended to comment on gender inequality, well, the quote itself is just fine. It makes clear that the narrator's had her situation defined and diagnosed by both her husband and her brother, and it's pretty clear that she also feels helpless. She says, "What is one to do?" She feels helpless in the face of their masculine authority. But unfortunately, as it stands now, the writer of the essay leaves that up to us to figure out, offering only the comment that now we know, quote, what the narrator's basic situation is. This is a classic example of an imbalance of quotes or plot summary in relationship to argument. What we need is more analysis after the quote. So if we delete the last sentence and substitute some analysis that connects back to the main claim, we've got a much more workable second paragraph. Something like this. From these and other similar comments the narrator makes throughout the story, it's clear that she feels helpless in the face of the male authority of her husband and brother. She seems not to have a say in her own recovery. For example, she's unsure exactly what kind of medicines and tonics she's taking. And she uses negative words like forbidden, which suggests that she is being ordered to do things or not to do them against her will. This is much better, and in fact, the writer could even devote another several lines to describing evidence for the portrayal of men as domineering tyrants. But for the purposes of our short essay today, this revision works as it offers comment on the evidence and it connects back explicitly to the main claim. Okay, so one more time, let's think back to the thesis statement. And because we made that thesis statement so specific, we know exactly what the next paragraph should be about. It should discuss the description of the narrator's bedroom and how that contributes to the main claim about gender inequality. Here's what the paragraph says. Charlotte's story really gets interesting when she describes the bedroom where the narrator is staying. Her description starts off very positively. It's a, quote, big airy room with windows that look all ways and air and sunshine galore, end quote. But then the description gets more ominous. The narrator tells us that the ripped wallpaper is incredibly ugly. Quote, the color is repellent, almost revolting, a smoldering, unclean yellow, strangely faded by the slow-turning sunlight. It is a dull, yet lurid orange in some places, a sickly sulfur tint in others. No wonder the children hated it. I should hate it myself if I had to live in this room long. It becomes clear, as we as readers continue to read, that this bedroom of the narrator is not really a playroom or nursery, but more like a prison. Charlotte is suggesting that her husband has put her in prison. Now, there are some positives and negatives in this paragraph. The first part of the paragraph sets us up to anticipate a move from positive to negative adjectives that describe the narrator's bedroom. And it sets us up for this pretty nicely. But then it only goes there in paraphrase. It'd be much more effective if we saw a couple more direct quotes. And then when it does move to the negative, it shifts to the yellow wallpaper itself, which, as arguably the main element of the story, really should get its own paragraph. And then the comment at the end, that it seems clear that the narrator's husband has essentially put her in prison. Well, this would work well if it was expanded just a little bit. But as it is now, in general, it does okay in that it does sort of point us back to the main claim. And before we rewrite this paragraph, let's go ahead and let's consider the next paragraph, the fourth, because we're going to sort of revise paragraphs 3 and 4 together. And as it stands now, the fourth paragraph says, as we reach the end of Charlotte's story, we see that the narrator has gone insane. She tells us in her journal that she sees a woman behind the pattern of the wallpaper who is trying to get out. She writes, quote, sometimes I think there are a great many women behind, and sometimes only one. And she crawls around fast, and her crawling shakes it all over, and she is all the time trying to climb through. But nobody could climb through that pattern. It strangles so. End quote. She goes on to say that she now believes the woman has escaped, and she can see her outside, quote-unquote, creeping about. The writing at the end of the story gets more and more disjointed as the narrator jumps from idea to idea and continues describing the yellow wallpaper in greater and greater horrific detail. She clearly has become totally insane. As we discussed last time, the writer at this point seems to have forgotten his main claim about gender, and instead is focusing on trying to show us that the narrator has become insane. And this is a point that really doesn't need any proving. In fact, it's sort of the main plot of the story itself. So essentially, this paragraph has a quote that could be used to make an argument, but it's only being used here in the interest of plot summary. All right, so let's try and rewrite those two paragraphs so that they match up with our new thesis statement. Here's a shot at improving paragraph 3, which we decided should be about the narrator's bedroom. In addition to the description of how the men in the narrator's life seem to have taken away the narrator's free will, the description of the bedroom functions to cast an ominous and forbidding aura over the narrator's situation. Her description of the bedroom starts off very positively. It's a, quote, big airy room with windows that look all ways and air and sunshine galore, end quote. But then the description gets more ominous. She comments that it must have been a nursery at one time because of the bars on the windows, and then perhaps a gymnasium because there are rings mounted on the wall. Other details in her description: the bed is nailed to the floor, and the bedposts look as if they have been, quote, gnawed on, all combine to produce the image of imprisonment. The images conjured up by this description of the room point clearly toward a comment on gender inequality, especially because the narrator says her husband insisted that she take this room for her own. Okay, this paragraph is much better in the way it explains the quote and then adds further details about the description of the room. And it also gives us a great opportunity to transition into that fourth paragraph, which is supposed to be about the yellow wallpaper itself. Here, what we can do is take parts of paragraphs 3 and 4 from the original essay, and we can revise and recombine them to make a persuasive point. So here's our new paragraph 4. By far, however, the most compelling piece of evidence that this is a story about gender issues and not simply insanity is made clear through the yellow wallpaper of the story's title. It is ripped in places, clearly deliberately torn, and the narrator tells us that, quote, the color is repellent, almost revolting, a smoldering, unclean yellow, strangely faded by the slow turning sunlight. It is a dull yet lurid orange in some places, a sickly sulfur tint in others. No wonder the children hated it. I should hate it myself if I had to live in this room long. End quote. As the story progresses, the hideous wallpaper preys upon the mind of the narrator, who's been forced by her husband to spend long hours in a room that she detests. Eventually, the narrator hallucinates what is arguably a metaphor for her own situation. She tells us that she sees a woman behind the pattern of the wallpaper and says, quote, sometimes I think there are a great many women behind, and sometimes only one, and she crawls around fast, and her crawling shakes it all over, and she is all the time trying to climb through, but nobody could climb through that pattern. It strangles so, end quote. The word strangles in this passage, along with the description of the woman as being behind the pattern and trying to get out, all suggest that there is something about the quality of being a woman rather than being insane that is at stake in Gilman's story. The story concludes with the narrator imagining that she and the woman in the wallpaper are the same person. And just like the woman behind the pattern, the narrator chillingly, quote-unquote, creeps around her room in an act so obviously insane that her husband faints at the sight of it. Again, this paragraph is stronger because it has a single focus, the yellow wallpaper. It has direct quotes, and it has sufficient explanation so we can see how this connects back to the main claim and how it connects back to that intro paragraph that set us up to be in this place at this time. Now, you always want to finish strong. You want to reiterate the main points of your introductory paragraph without simply restating them. Here's how the fifth and final paragraph reads as it stands right now. In conclusion, we can see that although the insanity is the most obvious issue in Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper, the more important issue is that of gender inequality. The narrator goes mad because she has been ordered to rest and not exert herself, even in activities that she likes. These decisions are made by men, her husband and her brother, and by the end of the story, we can see that the idea of the woman trapped behind the wallpaper functions as a metaphor for the narrator's own life. All right, there's some good stuff here. We're reminded what the thesis was, and the writer also reminds us of the depiction of the male characters and how that would seem to contribute to the idea of gender inequality. But the other 2 points about the bedroom and the wallpaper itself, they don't really get full treatment. And while I obviously think that a certain amount of what we might call signposting is really helpful in getting your reader to follow your argument more easily, starting the concluding paragraph with "in conclusion" is really too predictable and cliche. Okay, so let's try and rewrite that final paragraph so that it has a smoother transition from the one before it, so that it sums up all the evidence and it restates the main claim without simply repeating the intro paragraph verbatim. Why don't we try this as a concluding paragraph? Taken individually, the depiction of men the description of the bedroom that sounds more like a 19th century lunatic asylum than a nursery, and the narrator's obsessive hallucinations involving the yellow wallpaper could all be considered important elements in a story about one woman's descent into insanity. When we consider them all together, however, it becomes clear that the narrator's madness is a direct result of issues of gender inequality. Her husband dictates her rest cure and then assigns her a room that's more prison than anything else. And once in that room, the narrator's feelings of imprisonment, the feeling that her situation is literally killing her, manifest themselves in her hallucination of the woman in the wallpaper, who stands as a symbol for the narrator herself. The yellow wallpaper uses the idea of madness or insanity to demonstrate the dangers of sexual inequality in American society of the time. Now, this conclusion reminds us of the three main points of the paper. It restates them in terms that are somewhat different from that of the introduction, and it sums up the main idea quite nicely. Now, is this essay perfect? No, certainly not. Is it better now that it's been edited and rewritten? Absolutely. You might be thinking, and you might be rightly thinking, that the editing and rewriting process is really easy to describe and demonstrate when we're dealing with an academic essay. That's a form that's trying to make an argument, so it's relatively easy to spot weaknesses. You can ask, where does the argument fall apart? Where does it fail to persuade? But what about other types of writing? Well, I believe that anything can be made better with some editing and some rewriting. So let's consider something that's not an essay. How about something that's a letter to your local mayor, asking her to get behind renaming a local park in honor of John and Jane Smith, a couple who have been very active in charitable activities in your community. Let's consider a first draft of this letter and then see how we could maybe make it better. Here's the letter. Dear Peggy, I absolutely idolize John and Jane Smith. I cut out every newspaper article I read about them. They are always giving money to good causes and helping people live better lives. I've never heard of them asking for recognition for all the good things they do. I just think they deserve to have some recognition after everything they've done for people in our community and in other communities and for the arts and for cancer research and special education needs. I think we should name something after them, even if it's just a rock in the community park. Please help me honor John and Jane Smith. Sincerely, Rita Neighbor. All right, what does this letter have going for it? Well, it's definitely sincere and heartfelt. But the writer is so eager to get this recognition for John and Jane Smith that she doesn't seem to have taken much time in the writing of the letter. The words come out kind of breathlessly. They're sort of tumbling over one another, as if she was just writing every thought the moment it came into her head. How will we start to edit this and make it stronger? Let's start from a holistic perspective. What are your first impressions? The first thing that strikes me is that the letter writer, Ms. Rita Neighbor, starts out talking about herself. She says, if you remember, I absolutely idolize John and Jane Smith. I cut out every newspaper article. Well, that's all very nice, Rita Neighbor, but the goal of this letter is not to let people know what Rita Neighbor thinks about John and Jane Smith, but rather to get recognition for them. Rita Neighbor's longtime interest in their philanthropy can certainly be used to support her desired objective, but she needs to make John and Jane Smith the main focus from the beginning of the letter, and she needs to move herself to a secondary position. And speaking holistically, we can also zoom in on John and Jane Smith's accomplishments. As of now, they're listed kind of haphazardly and in no particular order. These accomplishments are all very important, but they should each get their own moment within the letter, so to speak. And finally, we might need some indication that other people besides Rita Neighbor think this is a good idea. On a finer level of detail, a few things leap out. First, when you're writing a letter to the mayor, even if she has been your best friend since kindergarten, you probably want to address her as Mayor Friendly rather than Peggy. There are also some grammatical and mechanical errors. The first sentence is a run-on due to a comma splice. That's probably harder for you to hear than if you were looking at it on the page, but trust me, comma splice there. And there are some moments where the tone is far too casual. There's an I've instead of I have, and they've instead of they have. So now that we've identified and edited in terms of some of the major issues, let's try rewriting the letter so that it's more powerful and more effective. Here's the revised version. Dear Mayor Friendly, as I'm sure you are well aware, local residents John and Jane Smith have changed our community and many others through their generous acts of philanthropy. I have followed their charity work for many years and been consistently impressed with how they have given large sums of money to causes as diverse as the arts, cancer research, and special education. I and many others in our neighborhood would like to honor the Smiths by renaming Neighborhood Park John and Jane Smith Park. Although it is a small token act of recognition, we hope that it would be meaningful to the Smiths since it is their neighbors who wish to honor them. Those of us interested in making this happen would be grateful if you could tell us how to go about setting the wheels for this in motion. Sincerely, Rita Neighbor. All right, what's different? Well, this letter is no longer about Rita Neighbor's long individual idolization of the Smiths, but it's about the Smiths themselves. Her long interest in their activities, however, is still useful, as she can cite the different areas in which the Smiths have made significant charitable contributions. Her writing tone is a little more formal, and she also takes care to indicate that she's not alone in this request. And finally, she asks the mayor for information on the steps necessary to make the renaming of a park possible. She doesn't just make a request and dump it in the mayor's lap. She indicates that she is willing to take an active role to accomplish whatever needs to be done. So what's the most important thing to take away from today's lecture? Well, I think that number one, it's to state a main idea or claim or a thesis that is as clear and as specific as possible. If you keep this main idea clearly articulated and detailed, and you keep it firmly in your mind as you write, and then you explicitly connect supporting points back to it, chances are you'll find that your writing flows much more naturally, and the structure of your writing will be easier to figure out, and your audience is going to be better able to follow you. A related point is to make sure that when you're writing, you never assume that your audience understands the point you're trying to make. For example, if you find a quote from a text that you think helps make your point, you cannot simply insert it into your essay and then not bother to explain it. Always spell things out. Signpost, in other words, so that your audience doesn't have to work too hard to follow whatever it is you're trying to say. So after this lecture and the one before it, you now have the basic tools to assess what needs to be edited or changed in a piece of writing, and now you have some guidelines for how to go about actually making those changes. One of the things that we mentioned briefly in our last example about the letter, but we didn't have a chance to talk about at any great length, is the very finest level of detail in terms of editing and rewriting. And this would be grammatical and mechanical mistakes. A misspelled word, a comma when it should be a semicolon, using I when you should say me, and vice versa. Although these details might seem minor, they are crucially important to producing a persuasive piece of writing. And next time, we'll devote an entire lecture to a discussion of 10 common errors and how to avoid them.